Located in the heart of Oklahoma City, the First Americans Museum stands as a cultural landmark, one that brings together the collective histories of 39 sovereign tribal nations whose roots now lie in Oklahoma. More than just a museum, this 175,000 square foot space is a living tribute to Indigenous resilience, creativity, and identity. Originally conceived in the 1980s, the project faced numerous funding challenges. Construction began in 2006, but was halted in 2012 due to budget shortfalls. It wasn't until a historic partnership with the Chickasaw Nation and support from private donors that the vision was revived and ultimately completed in 2001, more than 30 years after it was first imagined. Today, the First American Museum serves as both a cultural destination and an educational resource. It offers a powerful opportunity for Native and non-Native visitors alike to explore tribal histories, challenge stereotypes, and reflect on what it means to be First American in the past, present, and future. The museum starts off with an origins video describing the story of how the Pawnee, Yuchi, Caddo, and Otomissouri began. As I step into the Origins to 1830 gallery at the First Americans Museum, one of the first things I see is this large map of colorful circles scattered across the continent. These circles mark the original homelands of the 39 tribal nations now based in Oklahoma. It is a powerful visual. Each circle represents a place of emergence, where tribal nations trace their spiritual and physical beginnings. The exhibit reminds me that these aren't just locations on a map. They're stories passed down through oral tradition. They carry knowledge of the land, sky, and waters, and they root each other in a sacred geography. As I step into the Origins to 1830 gallery at the First Americans Museum, one of the first things I see is this large map of colorful circles scattered across the continent. These circles mark the original homelands of the 39 tribal nations now based in Oklahoma. It's a powerful visual. Each circle represents a place of emergence, where tribal nations trace their spiritual and physical beginnings. The exhibit reminds me that there aren't just locations on a map. They're stories passed down through oral tradition. They carry knowledge of the land, sky, and waters, and they root each other in sacred geography. Moving deeper into the gallery, I find myself in front of a section entitled Entangled. This part tells a layered story, how First Americans have lived there for more than 20,000 years. The museum explains that the origin stories tell people the first Americans have always been there. For thousands of years, the ancestors lived in balance with the land, guided by values like respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and relationships. But things change with European contact. This section of the exhibit clearly contrasts our holistic worldwide view with the European emphasis on separation, separating land from spirit, culture from politics, science from art. That disconnect, the museum says, opened the door to exploitation, colonization, and struggle. The museum displays tribal government structures and emphasizes how these systems are rooted in care, providing for the elderly, for health, education, and justice. There's a video display where tribal leaders talk about how sovereignty is lived, not just a legal concept. Before Europeans arrived, as many as 18 million first Americans lived across the land. They built cities, traded over great distances, and maintained political alliances. But colonization, through disease, war, and land theft, nearly wiped them out. By 1800, less than 1 million remained. Nearby, I see an exhibit titled Respected and Protected, highlighting traditional roles of women in leadership. I learned that in southeastern and Iroquois communities, women's councils held equal power. Some titles, like Clan Mother or Beloved Woman, carried decision-making authority, even over whether to go to war. It's shocking to learn how colonial powers refused to acknowledge these roles, forcing a gender imbalance that didn't exist before. The museum traces a sweep of disease from smallpox in 1519 all the way across the continent, killing up to 90% of the first American people. Whole nations were gone before ever seeing a European face. Another section dives into how capitalism, especially the fur trade, upended traditional economies. The Beaver Wars are described as some of the bloodiest conflicts in North America, with tribes caught between European rivalries. Maps show how displacement and migration unfolded in waves as competition over resources intensified. The museum honors tribal migration stories that predate European contact, and explains how tribal life was organized around water, constellations, and seasonal patterns. But with European encroachment, many tribes were displaced, sometimes into lands already inhabited by other nations. That disrupted relationships not just with the land, but with each other. As I move into the next section of the exhibit, the tone shifts to a heavier mood. The next section is entitled Indian Removal Act, a Federal Weapon. It begins with the date 28 May 1830, the day Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. There are quotes from members of Congress who opposed it, arguing that it violated every prior treaty and undermined the moral foundations of the nation. But those voices were drowned out. Driven by greed and the demand for land, the federal government moved forward, even after securing over 40 million acres through previous treaties. This act made federal policy to relocate tribal nations by force if necessary. It was built on the racist assumption that while white settlers were inherently superior and destined to take indigenous lands. The exhibit highlights how it wasn't just a policy, it was a weapon used against sovereign nations. The Cherokee brought two landmark cases to the U.S. Supreme Court, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia in 1830 and Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. The court acknowledged tribal sovereignty and ruled that state governments had no jurisdiction over tribal lands. But just beneath those rulings is a stark quote from President Andrew Jackson, defying the decision. Despite the Supreme Court's affirmation of tribal rights, Jackson ordered the forced removal of nearly 100,000 American Indians from their homelands. From 1830 to 1907, the exhibit shows how removal turned into policy after policy of assimilation and land theft. 67 tribes were relocated to now what is called Oklahoma. Reservation boundaries were drawn, erased, and redrawn. The 1887 Dawes Act was another blow, and it broke up communal land and forced individuals onto accepting private allotments. Over 90 million acres were lost. This was a calculated attack on tribal sovereignty. By 1898, the Curtis Act went even further. It dissolved tribal governments entirely and pushed more tribes onto allotments. In Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock in 1903, the U.S. Supreme Court gave Congress full authority to change or ignore treaties without tribal consent. Not all resistance was on the battlefield. The Cheyenne and Arapaho adapted to the Dawes Act in ways that preserved community. Families accepted allotments, but clustered them together, choosing homes near each other, building multiple dwellings, and keeping parts of the land communal. It was quiet resistance, but it protected cultural lifeways. The Osage, one of the last tribes relocated to Indian Territory, negotiated fiercely. They held on to assigned lands, retained mineral rights, and later became incredibly wealthy when oil was discovered in 1897. Their story shows how strategic negotiation can preserve sovereignty, even in exile. The next display is titled The State of Sequoia. It features a large map from 1905, boldly labeled Indian Territory. Around it are portraits of tribal leaders from the 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations. This was a moment the leaders tried to create a native-governed state, Sequoia, where their laws and traditions would be protected. They had already attempted something similar back in 1867 at a constitutional convention in Okmulgee, but that effort had fallen apart. Now in the face of the Curtis Act of 1898, which scheduled the termination of tribal governments by 1906, the pressure was mounting. In 1905, they acted. The State of Sequoia Constitution was drafted. Tribal nations lobbied Congress, but their efforts met a hard stop when President Theodore Roosevelt insisted on one unified state, Oklahoma. And in 1907, that became law. The dream of an all-Indian state was lost. The next room tells a different story, not one of defeat, but of resurgence. This part of the exhibit is called Braided Nations. The name invokes strands, tribal, state, and federal, that become intertwined, not always by choice. Here, the museum shifts the focus from colonization to resilience. The walls here show timeline panels beginning in the early 1900s. The 1924 Indian Citizenship Act granted U.S. citizenship to Native people, and in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act began reversing earlier assimilation policies, though Oklahoma was excluded. That changed 2 years later with the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, giving tribes the tools to reestablish governments and write constitutions. Then comes a moment of light. Photos from the 1970s showing tribal leaders signing contracts under the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. For the first time in generations, tribal nations could administer their own healthcare, education, and housing programs. It was a legal recognition of the first Americans know what's best for their own people. One wall honors the women who led the people forward. Wilma Mankiller, the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, and next to her, Mildred Cleghorn of the Fort Sill Apache, a teacher, leader, and one of the first women to chair a tribal nation after federal recognition. Their stories are personal, inspiring, and deeply rooted in tradition. The final stretch of this area is Oklahoma's creative natives. Artists, writers, and musicians began telling their own stories, countering centuries of stereotypes with truth, humor, and strength. They didn't just reflect on tribal culture, they redefined it for the future generations. Moving into the next gallery, there are vibrant murals, digital screens, and sculptures. The space is bold. It's titled Representation and Misrepresentation. The first thing I see is a wall filled with centuries-old European sketches of Native people, distorted and dehumanizing. These are not just artistic interpretations, they are political tools. By making them look primitive or savage, colonizers justified taking lands and erasing their voices. Across the room, modern Native artist answers back. They paint, photograph, sculpt, and remix history. One piece satires a Hollywood Indian chief, full headdress, plastic tomahawk, and all. There is a section called Laughter is Good Medicine, and there's an interactive exhibit called Welcome to Our House, where the Native families joke, tease, and poke fun at stereotypes. It's funny and healing, and it reminds me that humor is sacred. It's how we survive. We laugh at the lies to strip them of their power. First American games have always been more than play. They are ceremonies, community events, and at times diplomatic acts. The exhibit explains games such as Shiny, Chunky, and Peachstone game. The games are still played today, timed to the seasons, carried through generations. This exhibit also celebrates modern Native athletes. From small tribal leagues to Olympic stadiums, they continue to shine. There are jerseys from boarding school teams like Carlisle, whose football team victories challenged white stereotypes and gave Native youth a rare outlet for pride and visibility. The museum honors Oklahoma's own champions, Indigenous athletes who've risen through school sports and inspired generations. The final section of the exhibit is a tribute to first American warriors. The walls are adorned with symbols of honor, eagle feathers, war bonnets, and striking images of strength and resilience. Historically, warriors were the backbone of survival, bravely defending families, communities, and cultures. They weren't just soldiers. They were leaders, healers, and protectors. They preserved their way of life through their courage and commitment, facing extreme conditions without hesitation. Today, Native warriors still serve their communities, but not just in battle. While many first American men and women proudly serve in the military, warriors in this world also protect their sovereignty, language, resources, and rights. The warrior path extends beyond the battlefield. Women, too, have always been warriors. From the American Revolution to today's military service, Native women have stood strong in defense of their people. Today, more Native women serve in the U.S. military than any other ethnic group, but they also lead efforts in advocacy, cultural preservation, and environmental activism. Symbols of warrior status vary across tribes, but they all carry deep meaning. Eagle feathers, often worn by warriors, symbolize honor, strength, and courage. In the warrior's world, leadership and service go hand in hand. The exhibit also highlights Native veterans who served in numerous U.S. wars, despite the ironic reality that the lands were once seized by the very government they fought for. 1 in 9 First Americans serve in the U.S. military, a striking contrast to the general U.S. population, and their service, often prior to full citizenship, speaks to the enduring loyalty and pride they have for this land, their land. While the First Americans Museum offers a powerful and richly curated narrative of Native history, culture, and resilience, one noticeable absence is the representation of a contemporary and historical religious practices of the 39 tribal nations located in Oklahoma. While values such as respect, reciprocity, and community are interwoven throughout the museum's exhibits, explicit discussions or depictions of ceremonial life, spiritual belief systems, or sacred practices are limited. For practitioners of Native religious traditions, this omission leaves a gap in what could otherwise be a spiritually affirming experience. The museum speaks to origin stories, warrior societies, and traditional values, yet it stops short of exploring how these values are expressed through ceremonies, seasonal cycles, sacred sites, or traditional ecological knowledge tied to spiritual belief. This is especially important given that many of these practices have persisted despite aggressive federal policies aimed at religion suppression, such as the 1883 Code of Indian Offenses, the banning of ceremonial dances, and the slow restoration of religious rights through legislation like the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. To enrich the experience for Native practitioners and non-Native visitors alike, the museum could integrate more content on spiritual systems, traditional medicine, ceremonial protocols, and the ongoing efforts to protect sacred sites and religious freedoms. Doing so would provide deeper context for understanding how federal regulations historically impacted tribal religious life and how tribal nations today continue to resist and reclaim those sacred ways of being. For non-practitioners, such inclusion would offer not only cultural education, but also a deeper moral understanding of the ongoing fight for Indigenous religious freedom, identity, and self-determination.